we're going to talk about plant personalities, talk about non-native, invasive, and aggressive. Oftentimes these terms are used interchangeably, but they do have different meanings. So hopefully we'll be able to clear some of that stuff up today for you. So first off, before we define these others, we need to define what a native plant is. So native plant is going to be a plant that is part of the balance of nature that has developed over hundreds or thousands of years in a particular region or ecosystem. So that's a textbook definition there. And basically boil that down to a species that has evolved in a specific geographic area. So something like Spring Beauty here, where I'm located here in Jacksonville, those have just started blooming here in the last few days. That is native to Illinois and to this part of the state in central Illinois as well. They evolved in this area and naturally occur here. A lot of times you also hear these plants referred to as endemic plants. Not necessarily in everyday use, that's more of a, see that more in scientific papers, but endemic would mean the same thing. It is native to a particular area because it's adapted and fills a particular niche in the environment. So a few notes on native plants. So in addition to being native to an area, to a geographic area, we define native plants as being in an area at the time that scientific collection began in the area. So basically when Europeans started coming to North America is how we define native plants. If it was here before before Europeans showed up and started documenting stuff, we consider that native. But in a horticultural sense and in a gardening sense, what does native mean to you? We've got plants that are native to Illinois, but they may not be native to the entire state. And it may only be native to the northern part, the southern part, what have you. So if you're looking for native plants in your landscape and you want to stick to a native plant, how are you going to define that? Is it native to North America? Is it native to Illinois? Is it native to your particular part of the state or your particular county? How you define that in your landscape as far as what native is to you is going to vary depending on the individual. Some people are much more strict about that than others. And just a few notes on native plants in our landscapes. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because that's not the purpose of this presentation. But just because it's a native plant does not mean it's going to be a good garden plant. Some of our native plants can be spread rather readily, can take over small areas, so they may not be the best suited for a landscape. Does not necessarily mean they're going to have fewer disease and pest problems. Out in nature, we tend to overlook those things, but when this plant is growing right next to your front door and you see it every day, you're going to notice the leaf spots, the disease, the insects feeding on it. An example would be bee balm, Monarda. Late in the year, the stuff I have growing in my landscape is always covered in powdery mildew. It is very prone to getting that. A lot of times people talk when they don't have many pest and disease problems. They do. A lot of times we just overlook them. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to grow better. When we think about a typical housing development, particularly newer ones, when they're developed, a lot of times the topsoil is removed and it's not necessarily put back. So you're growing in subsoil or a mix of subsoil and topsoil. And that is not what our native species evolved with. We have less than ideal soil conditions a lot of times in a lot of our yards. And it does not mean they're going to be more desirable than native plants. So an example here, admittedly, a bit of an extreme example, but say you're taking a hike through the woods, you notice this flower here that's got all kinds of bees and stuff all over it. Think, hey, maybe this is something I want to put in my landscape for pollinators. This is poison ivy. Poison ivy is a native plant. I don't know of anybody that wants that in their landscape. So again, admittedly, an extreme example, but just because it's native does not mean it's going to be a good fit for our landscape. All right, so moving on, another example here. So bald cypress. Bald cypress is native to Illinois, so you may be familiar with this plant. A lot of times you find it in more swampy areas, has those knees that'll produce. It's deciduous, so it's going to drop its leaves in the fall, be bare in the winter, and then develop new leaves in the spring, even though it is a needled plant. This plant, while it is native to Illinois, it is native to the very southern part of Illinois. So yes, we can say it's native to Illinois, but it's not necessarily, it's vast majority of the state, it is not native to it. So again, depending on how you define native for your landscape, you may define bald cypress as native or not native. So basically what this is it is a translocated species, or a species that has been spread to an area where it is not native to. And that is done by humans. So I mentioned in the beginning that how we define native species is that before Europeans showed up. So did indigenous peoples, Native Americans, did they move plant material around? So how do we know exactly what the native range is? Do some plants, were they moved by indigenous peoples? So do we truly know the source of origin for some of these plants? If you go through and look at the historical literature, there's not a whole lot of evidence for widespread movement of plant material, usually regional at best, according to some of the papers that I looked at. So a lot of our tree species, our native forbs, things like that, those aren't necessarily spread wide distance. So we can probably assume that indigenous peoples, Native Americans, did not move those across the continent. On the other hand, some of our cultivated or cultigens, corn, sunflower, different types of gourds, tobacco, beans, those were widely spread by Native Americans from their centers of origin, typically in Mexico or the southwestern United States. While these are native crops to North America, most of them are not going to be native to the Midwestern part of the US. They were moved here even before Europeans showed up in North America. Since we're talking about native plants here and our gardens and stuff, talk a little bit about cultivar and variety. This is another term that is commonly used interchangeably. I am guilty of it. Probably most of us that work in the horticulture world, we're guilty of using cultivar and variety interchangeably, but they do mean different things. So first off, cultivar is a plant that is produced and maintained by humans, but does not necessarily produce true to seed. So these are usually created through breeding efforts. You're crossing specific plants to get a desired outcome and get that cultivar. They're not necessarily for the most part, they do not produce true to seed. So if you plant a seed from that plant, you're not going to get necessarily the same type of plant, that same cultivar, if you plant it. We see Nativar more and more nowadays. Nativar is just a cultivar of a native plant. So we've taken native and cultivar, smashed them together, we get Nativar. So it's just indicating that this is a cultivar of a native plant. And again, it has gone through breeding and stuff to get some result, whether that be new flower color, double flowers, things along those lines. And then finally, we have variety. Varieties are naturally occurring variation characteristics within the population, and they typically are going to produce true to seed. So if you collect seeds from that plant, it's got a specific flower color that is not quote unquote normal. It's different than most of the species out there. You get a seed from that, it'll come back true to form, so to speak. So example here, so we've got redbud, popular tree, native across eastern US and Midwest. Probably going to be blooming here relatively soon, depending on where you're at in the state, if not already. So typically, the typical form is going to have these pink flowers on them. There is a variety out there called Alba. Again, this is naturally occurring. It has white flowers. So you could plant this redbud, the Alba variety, and if it was going to produce seeds, more than likely they're going to come back white. This is naturally occurring. This was no human intervention to produce these types of plants. Here we've got the leaves, typical kind of heart-shaped leaves for our red buds, kind of greenish color. When they're mature, you can see here the young leaves kind of a copper color, but they will turn green as they get older. Here we have a cultivar called forest pansy. You can see those leaves are purplish reddish color. So this is done by crossing different plants and breeding it. This required human intervention to get this. So this would be a cultivar, or since this is a native plant, you could call it a nativar. So that's the difference there. Cultivar, nativar requires human intervention. Variety is naturally occurring. So now that we've defined what native plant is, a native species is, so it is a plant, we're talking about plants today, but it could be plant, animal, insect, what have you, that is naturally occurring in a designated geographic area. When scientific collection began in the area for North America, that's when Europeans arrived, which would make everything else non-native. So non-native is just a species that does not naturally occur in a specified area. And again, we need to specify the area there. This is all geographically based. These definitions are. So an example here would be daffodils. These are native to Europe and North Africa. They are not native to the United States. Another example here. So here we've got maples. These are maples that are native to Illinois. A wide variety of different maples we can find here. So first off, sugar maple. That's the maple we have here. It's what's commonly tapped to get maple syrup. You can do that with other maples too, but sugar maple has a higher sugar content in its sap. You can see here it is native to all of Illinois. So this would be a native plant anywhere in Illinois. We have something like red maple. Now, this is another one commonly planted, nice red foliage in the fall. While it is native to Illinois, it is only native to parts of Illinois. So if you're in southern Illinois or the Chicago area, red maple is a native plant. If you're in central Illinois, northwestern Illinois, it's not a native species to those areas. So again, native to Illinois, but not necessarily to the entire state of Illinois. So those areas, it would be non-native to central Illinois. And then finally, we have Norway maple, another commonly planted tree in our landscapes. And as the name would imply, it's probably not native around here. It is native to Europe. So this Norway maple would be non-native to Illinois and the United States. Norway maple was introduced. So the introduced species is a species brought to a new geographic area, either intentionally or unintentionally, by humans. So some more examples here. Something like wheat. Wheat is not native to North America. It is native to the Mediterranean, Middle East, and kind of Eurasia. That was brought over to North America to be grown. Peonies. They are native to Asia, Europe, and Western North America. The types we grow in our gardens are going to be the Eurasian types. The peonies that are native to North America out west, Washington, Oregon area, those flowers aren't as showy as our garden types that we typically grow. And then again, daffodils, native to Africa, Europe. Again, they were introduced into the United States as an ornamental plant. We also have things like chickens. Chickens are native to the tropical jungles of Southeast Asia. They were introduced into the United States for food. Same thing with honeybees. Honeybees are not native to North America. They were introduced by European colonizers. They are native to Europe, Asia, and North Africa. So again, just because a species is introduced, it does not necessarily mean it's a bad thing. Introduced sometimes is used as a negative term. It's just simply talking about, basically, these are species, plants that are brought into a new area, either intentionally or unintentionally. It is not talking about, or it doesn't concern how good or bad, so to speak, a plant is, any undesirable effects it may have. So another example here, Osage orange. This is widely found across the Midwest, up into Canada, a lot of parts of the United States. American settlers used Osage orange. You may also know it as hedge apple because it produces these large apple-like structures where the seeds are at. And these plants were widely used to make a kind of a living hedge. So the trees would be planted, they'd be severely pruned, and they'd send off sprouts and shoots, and these would weave together to create a dense, thorny barrier hedge. It's said to be horse high, bull strong, and pig tight. This is how people would separate fields and stuff. Before the invention of barbed wire in 1874, Osage orange was used to contain animals and define fields and things like that. So this is widespread across a lot of the United States. But this species native range is parts of Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. So this is the native range of Osage orange. It has been introduced to other parts of the United States. And since it is self-sustaining in these areas, it would be established in these areas. So an established species is a species that can self-sustain, reproduce on its own without the need for human intervention. So Osage orange would be established in Illinois. It can reproduce just fine without the help of humans. Now, it does not eventually become part of the local native plant community over time. It will never be, Osage orange will never be a native plant to Illinois because it is not native to this area. It is introduced. 100 years from now, 500 years from now, it still will not be a native species, no longer how long it's here. There's other examples, honeybees. Typically, we keep them in hives, but there are feral colonies that you can find. They are established. Those feral colonies don't need the help of humans to be able to exist. Dandelions would be another. These were brought over from Europe. Again, they have escaped cultivation, and they are widespread across a lot of the United States. Again, they survive just fine without the help of humans. And again, established is not talking about whether or not it's good or bad from a human perspective. It's just, is it able to sustain itself in an area without the help of humans? So whether that be good, bad. Invasive species would also be established because they can survive without the help of humans. A lot of times this is also referred to as naturalized. You'll see that term as well. The problem with naturalized, though, is nature is in there, and it kind of hints at maybe it is naturally supposed to be there. So naturalized can be a little bit confusing, maybe not the best term. I would argue that established is a better term to be using. So invasive species. This is the definition here from Executive Order 13112, which was signed by President Clinton back in 1999. This established a National Invasive Species Council. This executive order requires the formation of the council from different departments in the federal government that deal with invasive species. That executive order defines an invasive species as a non-native or alien species to an ecosystem under consideration, and a species whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic harm, environmental harm, or harm to human health. So in order for a species to be invasive, for our purposes today, we're talking about plants, but it could be insects or diseases, animals, what have you. It has to be non-native, it has to be introduced, doesn't matter how it was introduced, whether it was intentional or not, and it has to cause or is likely to cause some sort of damage, whether that be environmental, economical, or harm humans in some way or the other. Those are the three criteria a species needs to fit in order to be considered invasive. So some examples here. On the left, we've got winter creeper. This was introduced into the US around 1907 as an ornamental ground cover. It has escaped cultivation. It can be found in forested areas where it carpets the ground, grows up trees. It could choke out trees if it gets big enough, things like that. This is native to China, Korea, and Japan. It was introduced into the United States. And because it is causing damage, it can cause damage to natural areas, would be considered invasive, at least in some parts of the United States. In the middle there, this is an elm tree with Dutch elm disease. This is a fungus that is a non-native fungus that is spread by both native and non-native bark beetles. So this particular pathogen is native to Asia. It's called Dutch elm disease because it was discovered in the Netherlands. It was first described there, so that's how I got the name, but it is actually native to Asia. So the fungus that causes this disease is non-native, as well as some of the insects that spread it are non-native, but native species will too. And then on the right, something everybody's probably familiar with, if you have many plants in your landscape, is Japanese beetles. These were first discovered in 1916, probably introduced several years before that into New Jersey, Pennsylvania area, probably brought in on imported ornamental plants and slowly spread across the United States. Again, this is causing damage to ornamental plants, native plants. So this would also be considered an invasive species. So it doesn't have to be just plants. It can be other things as well. One term commonly here is native invasive. So can native plants be invasive? So by the definitions we've been talking about, no, it can't. So an invasive species is a non-native or alien species. So right off the bat, technically speaking, native species cannot be invasive. So we shouldn't be using the term native invasive, just because by the way we define that, they can't be. How we should be defining these native plants that can be troublesome, we could be opportunistic native plant. So this would be a plant that is able to take advantage of disturbances in the soil or existing vegetation for some reason, and can spread quickly and outcompete other plants in that disturbed site would be one example. Could also define these plants as aggressive. So this would be species, usually because of human caused disturbances, spread rapidly. It can outcompete other plant species. So it spreads faster than, or it will spread faster than you want to. If we're talking about like a landscape, take over an area and grow further than you really want it to. So an example of this would be goldenrod. Not all goldenrods are troublesome, but something like Canada goldenrod can be rather aggressive. It is an opportunistic plant. It does well in disturbed sites and can quickly kind of monopolize and take over an area, like this picture here. Again, that's Canada goldenrod. There are other goldenrod species that are not nearly as aggressive and problematic as Canada goldenrod. Again, because it is a native species, we would not consider that invasive. Could also call these problematic plants nuisance plants. So basically these plants are causing management issues or property damage, or presents a threat to public safety, or is an annoyance. So this could be native and non-native species. So again, poison ivy. would be a threat to public safety because of the oils and the rashes that can cause. Again, that is a native species. Something like honeybees, typically we associate those as being beneficial, but if they're building a hive in your house in a wall void, something like that, that would be a nuisance. Same thing with yellow jacket, something like that. Those are beneficial insects. They'll go out and feed on caterpillars and other insects we would consider pests. Feed those to their young, but they may be building a nest in your wall voids in the ground near an area where people frequent, where they can pose a danger to people walking by. Deer would be another example, going in and eating plants in your landscape, eating your hostas and what have you in your landscape. So again, another native species, but it still can be problematic. Another example here would be northern sea oats. This is a native plant, a native grass species that is commonly planted in our landscapes. It's a nice looking plant, clump forming, say 2 to 5 feet tall. I usually see it more 3-4 foot tall range. Find it in wooded areas, slopes, can also grow in full sun, so it's quite adaptable. People are typically growing it because picture in the middle there has these really kind of ornamental, nice looking seed heads on there. But this plant can be problematic in landscapes. It will grow, spread readily through the seeds. So you can see on the picture on the right there, it'll drop its seeds and it can form large patches. It'll also spread through rhizomes through the ground. So it can be aggressive, particularly in shaded areas where you don't have necessarily a lot of plants that really like that environment. This can really outcompete a lot of plants and kind of take over. So it can be a nuisance plant depending on the location and how it's treated. We also have weeds, depending on your plant and how you look at it. So a weed is a plant whose virtue has yet to be found. Henry David Thoreau. Again, a lot of times a weed is going to be up to the individual. So the common usage as a weed is a plant. It can be a native or non-native plant that is not valued in the place where it is growing. So it's a plant out of place. So example here, we've got common violet. That's the state flower of Illinois. It's a native species. Many people do not want that in their turf grass. It is a non-desirable species to have in turf, so a lot of people consider that a weed. This is my lawn. I encourage it. I'm pretty hands-off on my lawn. As long as it's green, it's okay. So violet to me, I would not consider that a weed, but other individuals would consider it a weed if it's growing in their lawn. A lot of this is dependent on the individual as to whether or not it is considered a weed species. I'll get into some of the legal definitions here. All right, so Illinois has an Exotic Weed Act. So we get into some text walls here because these are how they are defined by the legislation here. So exotic weeds are plants not native to North America, which when planted either spread vegetatively or naturalize and degrade natural communities, reduce the value of fish and wildlife habitat, or threaten Illinois endangered or a threatened species. So that's how these are defined by the Illinois Exotic Weed Act. Part of that act, it also says that it shall be unlawful for any person, corporation, political subdivision, agency, or department of the state to buy, sell, offer for sale, distribute, or plant seeds, plants, or other plant parts of exotic weeds without a permit issued by the Department of Natural Resources. So basically, these are these problematic weeds. We could call them invasive species here in Illinois, and it is illegal to move this plant material around and to sell it. So these are the designated exotic weeds here in Illinois. So we can see the exotic bush honeysuckles, Japanese honeysuckle, multiflora rose, the different buckthorns, kudzu, exotic olives, poison hemlock, giant hogweed, oriental bittersweet, easel, knotweed. A lot of these problematic plants that we hear about a lot as being invasive, getting into natural areas, are designated exotic weeds. So you cannot buy, sell, move these plants around in the state of Illinois. It's not illegal to have them, but you cannot move them around. The exotic species says nothing about having to manage them. So you can have a landscape full of honeysuckles. We see that all over the place. You don't have to control it, but it is an exotic species. You cannot move that around. I was down in St. Louis area this weekend. You can see the bush honeysuckles are all starting to leaf out down there. It's pretty easy to see those. Some of these are all over the place, but we are not required to get rid of them. We also have noxious weeds. So this is from the Federal Plant Protection Act. So any plant or plant product that can directly or indirectly injure or cause damage to crops, including nursery stock or plant products, livestock, poultry, or other interests of agriculture, irrigation, navigation, natural resources of the United States, public health, or the environment. So the USDA APHIS, Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, maintains a list of federally recognized noxious weeds. So it is illegal to import these listed weeds or transport them across state lines. And there's a link to that there. If you really want that, you can send me an email. Like, you can send that to you, or you can just do an internet search for Federal Plant Protection Act. You can get a list of those species that are considered noxious weeds in the United States. Illinois also has a noxious weeds list. So this is determined by the director of the Department of Agriculture, as well as the dean of the College of ACES, the University of Illinois, and the director of the Ag Experiment Station at the University of Illinois. These are going to be plants that are injurious to public health, crops, livestock, land, or other property. So with noxious weeds in Illinois, not only can you not sell them and move them, but you are required by law to remove them from property that you own. So there's different control authorities. So these are the governing bodies of each county that are in charge of enforcing this law. Now, that's going to vary on the county where you live. Not all counties are going to have the same person or department enforcing this. A lot of times it's the road commission is in charge of enforcing this, but it may vary depending on where you live. And a lot of times it's not very well enforced. So these are the plant species that are considered noxious weeds in Illinois. So common ragweed, giant ragweed. Asterisk is there because these only need to be controlled within city limits. If it's out in the country, so to speak, these are not considered noxious. Marijuana, musk thistle, Canada thistle, kudzu, perennial south thistle, and perennial members of the sorghum genus. These are noxious weeds. If you have these on your property, you are required to remove these to help get rid of them, because they do pose a threat to different agricultural and natural resource interests. Illinois also has their injurious species rule. So these are based upon the potential threat to indigenous wildlife, aquatic life, or habitat. There is a federal list as well. The federal list is primarily vertebrate species on there, but Illinois does have its own list, and it has 28 plant species listed on there. And you can find that, again, you can do an internet search for Illinois Injurious Species Rule, and you can bring up the legislation and that list of plants. There's 28 on there. And again, you cannot possess, propagate, buy, sell, barter, transported, traded in the state of Illinois without a permit from the Department of Natural Resources. So again, you have to have permission to have these plants. All right, so that's what I've got for you today. Some of the different definitions of, or some ways we can define plants in our landscapes. Like Nancy mentioned, this is a series, so we have these going back, I don't know how many years now, on our YouTube page, University of Illinois Extension Horticulture YouTube page. You can find that here. And like Nancy mentioned, we do have a couple coming up. So if you're interested in more native plants, that's April 25th, Native Plants Sequence of Bloom. That's going to be with Elizabeth Pauly. And then if you want more on invasive species and probably learn a little bit more about the individual species that can be problematic, May 16th is Invasive Plants Beyond Outlawed with Chris Enroth. It's probably getting stuff like calorie pear. Some of those aren't necessarily listed as invasive or exotic species that maybe probably should be. And with that, we can go to questions here. If you've got a smartphone, you can take a picture of that QR code for the evaluation, or you can go to go.illinois.edu/plants-to-find and fill out the evaluation for today's program. And thanks everybody for being on.